For several haunting seconds after the blade falls, the human head may remain aware. The eyes still flicker. The mouth still shapes words that no longer reach the air, and a trace of consciousness trembles on the edge between life and death. It is within this narrow, dreadful space that Anne Boleyn may have existed after her beheading, the once crowned Queen of England, now reduced to a silent fragment of herself, staring into the void her husband created. Most retellings glide gently over this moment, disguising its horror beneath the decorum of history. But if one lingers, if one dares to look closer, the truth becomes unbearable. Anne's death was not simply a single stroke of steel, it was the climax of a deliberate design meant to annihilate her mind before her body. In Tudor England, death was not justice, it was theater. Every pause, every delay, every cruel whisper in the tower was part of a script written to break her spirit before the sword ever touched her neck. And when it finally did, the horror was not that she died, but that she had been forced to die long before the executioner arrived. By the time Anne Boleyn was taken to the Tower of London in May of 1536, her fate had already been decided. The fortress that had once prepared her for her coronation now became the stage of her slow destruction. 3 years earlier, those same walls had echoed with the celebration of her rise, a triumph of beauty, intelligence, and political ambition. But now, those halls whispered of betrayal and decay. For 17 long days, she lived not as a queen, but as a ghost in her own kingdom, surrounded by guards who once knelt before her and attendants who dared not meet her eyes. The tower was more than a prison, it was a psychological device. Every sound of the city outside reminded her of a world that had already moved on. Henry VIII, the man who had once torn his country apart to marry her, dragged out her agony with deliberate precision. He postponed her execution again and again, allowing hope and despair to tangle in her mind until both lost meaning. Even the promise of a swift death became a weapon. He announced that a French swordsman, famed for his skill, would be summoned to perform the act. Not an English axeman, as was customary. It was described publicly as an act of mercy, but Anne knew better. The message was clear. She would die not as an English queen, but as a foreign criminal, severed from her homeland in every sense. Each dawn began the same, the sound of footsteps outside her door, the creak of locks, the brief terror that it was time, followed by the crushing realization that it was not. Sleep eluded her, prayer brought no peace. She had been accused of adultery, incest, and conspiracy to murder the king, charges so absurd they mocked reason itself. Yet she knew that the truth no longer mattered. The machinery of power had begun to turn, and she was trapped within it. The courtiers who had once vied for her favor now competed to denounce her. Even her enemies whispered that the accusations were impossible, but silence was the only safety left in Henry's England. Anne's composure during those days astonished her jailers. She laughed often, spoke gently, and even jested about her little neck, a phrase that spread through the court like wildfire. But that brightness was not serenity, it was collapse masked as courage. Modern psychology would call it dissociation, the mind's desperate retreat from reality. Every smile hid a fracture, every joke was a shield. The walls of her chamber seemed to close in, echoing with rumors and footsteps. She wrote letters she was never allowed to send, perhaps to Henry himself, pleading not for mercy, but for justice. None reached their destination. Her words were intercepted, examined, and discarded like evidence from a crime already solved. Outside the tower, the city of London prepared for spectacle. Gossip spread like smoke, fanned by Thomas Cromwell's deliberate campaign of slander. Anne's name was dragged through the mud, her allies silenced or imprisoned, her accomplishments twisted into signs of arrogance and deceit. Henry's court, always hungry for scandal, consumed her downfall with a mixture of awe and fear. They watched the queen unraveling as if it were divine justice, forgetting that their own safety depended on the same fickle power. By the 17th dawn, Anne had stopped asking when her time would come. There was a strange calm in her voice when she spoke to her attendants, a calm born not of peace, but exhaustion. She understood that her body was still alive only because Henry willed it so that her breath existed for the convenience of others. When the summons finally arrived, it came quietly, no grand announcement, no formal decree, only a nod from a guard who could not meet her gaze. Her time had come, not as a queen summoned to ceremony, but as a condemned woman led toward erasure. When Anne Boleyn was finally summoned from her chamber on the morning of May 19, 1536, London was already awake with anticipation. The air outside the tower carried the murmurs of a crowd that had gathered not out of grief, but curiosity, drawn by the promise of witnessing the fall of a queen. The sky was deceptively clear, a cruel irony that mocked the darkness of the day. Inside the tower, the corridors she once walked as a monarch had been stripped of ceremony. The same stone passages that once echoed with royal processions now carried only the muffled steps of guards escorting a condemned woman toward the scaffold. It was not a punishment, it was theater, meticulously choreographed by a king who wanted her death to serve as both warning and spectacle. Anne's final walk through the tower was an inversion of her triumphal arrival 3 years earlier. No courtiers bowed, no musicians played. Instead, she passed through silence thick with fear. The guards avoided her eyes, unwilling to see the humanity of the woman they had been ordered to destroy. Every element of the execution had been designed to dismantle her dignity. The scaffold itself was a low platform, barely 3 feet high, not the elevated stage of legend, but something humbler, intended to force her closer to the crowd, to strip her of the separation that royalty once demanded. She would die not above them, but among them. Henry VIII's decision to use a French swordsman was not an act of mercy, as some historians have suggested. It was an aesthetic choice. The sword would deliver a clean, precise stroke, sparing the onlookers the horror of repeated blows, but ensuring the event remained swift, controlled, and almost elegant, a performance devoid of compassion. The expense of summoning this executioner was immense, yet Henry spared no cost in crafting the illusion of justice. The English axe, with its brutal weight and uncertain aim, was too coarse a tool for the refined vengeance he desired. He wanted the world to remember, not the clumsy spectacle of blood, but the image of a calm and efficient demise, a death so composed it might appear ordained. Anne was calm that morning, though calmness had long since lost its meaning. Her attendants described her as almost cheerful, laughing softly and exchanging final words of gratitude. But beneath that fragile smile was a mind fractured by days of waiting. Every delay had been a deliberate act of cruelty. She had spent hours on her knees in prayer the night before, pleading for peace, but peace had refused her. The sound of bells from the city below, the distant chatter of crowds, the whisper of wind through the tower walls, all of it pressed against her mind until silence itself became unbearable. When she was told the time had come, she simply nodded, as though death were the only relief left to her. Outside, the crowd surged with morbid excitement. Witnesses were chosen carefully, noblemen, officials, and a scattering of citizens allowed to stand as symbols of England's judgment. Among them, Thomas Cromwell watched with cold precision, ensuring that every gesture, every line of Anne's final speech, unfolded as expected. She was permitted to address the audience, but the privilege was hollow. Every word had to be measured, every phrase crafted to avoid suspicion of defiance. She spoke of her submission to the law, of the mercy of the king, of her faith in God's will, not because she believed in the justice of her sentence, but because she knew rebellion would only deepen her disgrace. And so she played her final role, the condemned queen who met death with grace. It was the ending Henry wanted, the image of humility that validated his cruelty. Yet even as she knelt, the illusion fractured. The woman who had been accused of sin and treason radiated a strange composure, a nobility that the crown could strip from her head but not from her soul. Those who watched sensed it, though none dared to speak. In the stillness before the blade fell, they saw not a traitor, but the quiet ruin of a woman destroyed by the man who once called her beloved. The scaffold stood on Tower Green, a space both intimate and exposed, surrounded by the gray stones of the fortress that had witnessed centuries of coronations and betrayals. Anne Boleyn stepped onto the platform with the steady grace of someone who had finally reached the end of endurance. The wooden planks creaked beneath her feet, the air heavy with silence that carried more weight than any outcry could. She was dressed simply in a dark gown, her long hair gathered beneath a linen cap, her hands folded before her as though preparing for confession. The crowd that had gathered nobles, guards, servants, and commoners alike watched in breathless expectation, unable to decide whether they were witnessing justice or murder. In that moment, the queen who had once commanded the hearts of men stood utterly alone, surrounded not by courtiers but by strangers waiting to see her die. The French executioner stood a few paces away, his sword hidden from her sight. Henry had spared her the sight of the weapon, not from mercy, but because anticipation was its own form of torture. The man was skilled, renowned for his precision, but to Anne he was merely another player in a pageant designed to erase her. Tradition required that she be blindfolded, and as the cloth was drawn across her eyes, the last light of her world vanished. Witnesses said she whispered prayers beneath her breath, her lips trembling but her voice steady. "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul," she murmured, as if speaking to a distant listener beyond the reach of cruelty. Beneath the blindfold, her eyes darted, listening for the faint shuffle of feet, the breath of the executioner, the soft rustle that would mark the final instant. The waiting was the worst of it. Time stretched, becoming elastic and unreal, every heartbeat an eternity. The human mind, when facing death, begins to resist the moment, creating a storm of sensations and thoughts too vast to contain. Some witnesses claimed that she seemed to sense the sword's movement before it came, as though her body, in its final act of defiance, reached beyond the blindness imposed on her. The executioner called softly to his assistant to distract her, stepping forward in the same breath, and with a single, flawless stroke, the blade swept clean through. It was said that she never flinched, that her lips were still moving in prayer when the sword passed through flesh and air. For those who watched, it was both swift and unbearable. The head fell onto the straw with a dull thud, the body collapsing gracefully as though in slow motion. For a heartbeat, there was silence, a silence that seemed to swallow sound itself. Then the crowd erupted. Some gasped, some cried out, others fainted. A few murmured prayers, while others muttered approval, eager to appear loyal to their king. Yet even amid the horror, one detail transfixed them all: the strange persistence of life. Several witnesses swore that Anne's eyes still flickered, that her lips moved as though continuing the prayer left unfinished. For a few dreadful seconds, the severed head appeared not dead, but merely separated, still conscious in that liminal space between body and oblivion. It was the perfect image of Tudor cruelty, a queen's final humiliation rendered in flesh and silence. When it was over, the attendants moved hesitantly, uncertain whether they were to touch the remains. No coffin awaited her. Her ladies, trembling and weeping, were forced to improvise, placing her body and head into an old arrow chest found nearby. The image was almost unbearable. The woman who had once been crowned in Westminster Abbey, lowered into a crude wooden box as though she were refuse. The executioner, his work complete, lifted her head by the hair to display it to the crowd. The gesture, customary yet grotesque, transformed Anne from a person into a symbol, her death a statement of royal power. Blood dripped from the neck, glinting in the morning light, while murmurs of both pity and horror spread through the gathering. In that moment, Anne ceased to be a queen, or even a woman. She became a message, an emblem of what happened when a subject, even one crowned, defied the will of the king. Yet the power Henry sought in that display was tainted by something unspoken, a collective recognition that this had not been justice, but annihilation. The sword had silenced her voice, but it had not destroyed her image. For those who saw her die, the memory of that serene, almost luminous composure lingered long after the executioner had departed. In the shadow of Tower Green, power had revealed its truest face, not strength, but fear disguised as authority. When the crowd dispersed and the blood dried on the straw, Anne Boleyn was gone, not just as a living woman, but as a presence the king wished to erase. Henry VIII's vengeance did not end with the stroke of a sword. It continued in silence, in the careful unmaking of everything she had ever been. Her attendants, broken by grief, gathered her remains with trembling hands. There was no coffin prepared, no procession, no hymn. An old chest, once used to store arrows, became her final cradle. Within its crude wooden frame, the body of a queen was placed hastily, head and torso wrapped in a torn cloth, lowered into a shallow grave beneath the chapel floor of St. Cenis, Peter ad Vincula. The burial was conducted without ceremony, without even a marker to note where England's queen lay. It was as if she had been buried not in earth, but in oblivion. But Henry's cruelty reached beyond the grave. Within days, orders spread across the court. Her emblems were to be scraped from walls, her portraits burned, her name omitted from every royal record. Painters were instructed to remove the initial A from tapestries, to alter inscriptions where her presence had once been celebrated. Those who had served her now spoke her name only in whispers, fearful that even a memory might condemn them. The court that had once been hers now belonged entirely to Jane Seymour, the woman who would replace her before Anne's body had even cooled. In the machinery of power, grief was not permitted to exist. The erasure of Anne Boleyn was not a tragedy, but a political necessity. Among her ladies-in-waiting, the trauma lingered. They'd been forced to clean the blood from the scaffold, to collect their mistress's severed head, to prepare her remains in silence. The experience hollowed them. Some left court forever, unable to bear the memories of that morning. Others sought refuge in convents, trading the suffocating fear of the palace for the quiet anonymity of prayer. The nightmares persisted. The image of the blade, the sound of the crowd, the sight of their queen kneeling. Those who spoke of her did so in private, as though conjuring a forbidden ghost. For them, Anne's death was not the end of a reign. It was a lesson in submission, a reminder that the king's will could unmake even the highest among them. And yet, the shadow of her execution spread far beyond the Tower. The fear it inspired seeped into every corner of England's nobility. The message was unmistakable. If a crowned queen could fall so completely, then no subject was safe. Silence became the new language of survival. At court, courtiers measured every word, every glance, every gesture. Even loyalty became dangerous, for yesterday's favorite could become tomorrow's traitor. Henry's tyranny had found its purest expression in the image of Anne's severed head, a warning that power no longer required justification, only obedience. But the consequences of her death reached even deeper, touching the innocent. Her daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was stripped of her royal status and declared illegitimate. Her small household was dismissed, her servants reassigned, her needs neglected. The child who should have inherited a throne was left to drift in political limbo, an orphan of her mother's disgrace. In this final act, Henry ensured that Anne's punishment extended beyond life, haunting the next generation. The little girl who had once been England's future became a ghost in her own palace, her mother's name a forbidden word. Yet history, as it would later prove, does not always obey the intentions of kings. The attempt to erase Anne Boleyn only ensured that her story would endure. In her destruction, Henry revealed the fragility of his own creation, a kingdom built on fear, where memory itself became a battlefield. The scaffold had silenced her voice, but her image, her influence, and her bloodline would return to defy him. For in the buried child he sought to forget, the future of England was waiting, patient and unbroken. In the years that followed Anne Boleyn's execution, the story of her death was reshaped again and again, bent to the will of those who needed it to mean something different. Henry VIII's government rewrote the narrative with deliberate precision. They called her end merciful, her punishment just, her fall inevitable. The skilled swordsman from France was recast as a sign of the king's compassion, the swift stroke as evidence of his grace. What the witnesses had seen, a public killing staged with the discipline of theater, was retold as a dignified conclusion to a queen's tragic missteps. Through propaganda and rumor, Henry VIII transformed cruelty into clemency and treason into divine order. The truth, soaked into the scaffold's planks and buried beneath the Tower chapel, was left to rot in silence. At court, the pace of life did not falter. Within a single day of Anne's execution, Henry became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour, the quiet woman who had waited patiently for his favor. 2 weeks later, they were married in a private ceremony at Whitehall Palace. The speed of the transition was staggering. No period of mourning was observed, no public prayer was offered for the queen who had just been executed. To the courtiers, this swiftness was a clear command to forget. The message was that sentiment had no place in the machinery of monarchy. Anne's death was not a tragedy, but an administrative solution, a correction in the king's personal ledger, closing one chapter to begin another. The same halls that had once echoed with her laughter now filled with new music, new gowns, new whispers of favor. Her erasure seemed complete, yet her shadow lingered in every chamber where she had once ruled. For those who dared to remember her, the memory was unbearable. Thomas Wyatt, the poet who had once admired her, perhaps even loved her, wrote lines that mourned the little neck that had once worn jewels and smiled at kings. His verses, passed in secret, captured the transformation of a living woman into an artifact of terror. She had become an emblem of what power could do to truth, a warning carved into England's collective conscience. Historians centuries later would call her death a political necessity, but those who had seen it knew better. It was not necessity that guided Henry's hand, but fear. Fear of losing control, fear of defiance, fear of a woman whose intellect and influence had grown too bright for a man who could not share the throne of attention. Yet the very thing Henry sought to destroy her legacy became immortal. Her daughter, the child stripped of her birthright, would rise decades later to become Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs in England's history. The woman Henry had declared illegitimate gave rise to the age that would define the nation. In Elizabeth's strength and cunning, people saw echoes of her mother, the wit, the poise, the quiet defiance. Through her daughter's reign, Anne Boleyn's name returned to history, not as a warning, but as a symbol of endurance. Henry had won every battle but lost the war against memory. The truth he tried to bury beneath the tower's stones grew roots that would outlast his dynasty. Today, when we remember Anne Boleyn, we no longer see only the doomed queen or the scandalous figure painted by her enemies. We see the machinery of propaganda that tried and failed to erase her, the cruelty disguised as ceremony, the calculated silence that followed her death. Her story endures because it exposes the oldest truth about power, that it is never satisfied with obedience. It demands control over memory itself. Anne Boleyn was not merely executed. She was rewritten, censored, and almost lost to history. Yet even 500 years later, her voice, once silenced, continues to whisper through the corridors of time. Her fall reminds us that history belongs not to those who hold the sword, but to those whose stories refuse to die. And if you found the courage to witness this truth, to see beyond the polished myths and into the dark heart of Tudor power, then remember, every forgotten story waits for someone to speak it again. So, keep searching, keep questioning, and keep the past alive. Like, share, and subscribe, because the more light we shine on the forgotten, the less power darkness holds over history.